We're here to talk about what you're looking for in life. A recent advertising campaign by a bank encourages us to talk to ourselves more about what you really want. It's an NAB advertising campaign. Talk to yourself more about what you really want. And the General Manager of Brand Experience for NAB, Michael Nierhaus, says about the campaign explains through unscripted voices that whether you're a celebrity, paediatric nurse, a business owner or an NAB employee, you can get to the heart of what it is that you really want from life by talking to yourself more. Well, I think it's not bad advice, actually, that maybe we do need to talk to ourselves more about what we really want and get clear about that. Obviously, they think that if you talk to yourself more about what you really want, you'll end up deciding that you need to borrow money, and that's the idea there. But actually, a conversation with yourself in which you think about what you really want, I think, could be a really good thing, and that's, in fact, what I'd like to encourage everyone to do for the next 3 weeks as we look at this series, just to think about that. As we've talked to people on the campus, one of the things that people have said that what they really want in life is to live up to their potential, to realise their potential in life, and that also people have expressed anxiety about failing to reach their potential. So we're going to talk about that in the third week. Next week we're going to talk about pleasure, that there's a general kind of vibe that a way to think about life is about maximising your pleasure and minimising your pain. And so we're going to just talk about, well, if that's the way that a person sees their life and if that's what they really want, where would that lead? Is that a good way to think about life? So that's next week. And this week, just the more general question about meaning and purpose. As you think about what is the meaning, what it is that you really want, what you're really dealing with there is the question of your purpose. What's the meaning of your life? And as we look at each of these three topics, I really want to just work towards saying why I think Christianity is worth considering, why I think a Christian view of these things, why Christianity actually helps us to think in the best possible way about each of these things, meaning in life, potential and pleasure. And that if you come away from these weeks, if you're not a believer in Jesus, not a follower of Jesus, if you come away from these weeks thinking, yeah, I actually could seriously consider Christianity, I could investigate Christianity and find out more, I'm open to thinking about it, well, that would be a great outcome from my point of view. If you're someone who's already a follower of Jesus, then I think these weeks could be really helpful for you thinking, well, how can I actually engage with and talk to my friends and my family, people around me, about Christian faith in a way that is worth exploring, that people find worthwhile and interesting. So that's what I'm trying to do with these weeks. So it won't be a Bible exposition for these 3 weeks, if you're used to that. It'll be a slightly different topical kind of talk. So to start us off thinking about this issue of meaning and purpose in life, I want to read to you from a book that was released this year called Enlightenment Now by an American scholar, a cognitive psychologist called Steven Pinker, and you might have heard of him. He's written quite a number of books. He's a great advocate for the view that the world is getting better all the time, and this is from the introduction to part 1 of his new book, Enlightenment Now. Let me read it to you. In the course of several decades giving public lectures on language, mind and human nature, I've been asked some mighty strange questions. Which is the best language? Are clams and oysters conscious? When will I be able to upload my mind to the internet? Is obesity a form of violence? But the most arresting question I've ever fielded followed a talk in which I explained the commonplace among scientists that mental life consists of patterns of activity in the tissues of the brain. A student in the audience raised her hand and asked me, "Why should I live?" The student's ingenuous tone made it clear that she was neither suicidal nor sarcastic, but genuinely curious about how to find meaning and purpose if traditional religious beliefs about an immortal soul are undermined by our best science. My policy is that there is no such thing as a stupid question. And to the surprise of the student, the audience, and most of all myself, I mustered a reasonably creditable answer. What I recall saying went something like this. In the very act of asking that question, you are seeking reasons for your convictions, and so you are committed to reason as a means to discover and justify what is important to you. And there are so many reasons to live. As a sentient being, you have the potential to flourish. You can refine your faculty of reason itself by learning and debating. You can seek explanations of the natural world through science and insight into the human condition through the arts and humanities. You can make the most of your capacity for pleasure and satisfaction, which allows your ancestors to thrive and thereby allowed you to exist. You can appreciate the beauty and richness of the natural and cultural world. As the heir to billions of years of life perpetuating itself, you can perpetuate life in turn. You have been endowed with a sense of sympathy, the ability to like, love, respect, help, and show kindness. And you can enjoy the gift of mutual benevolence with friends, family, and colleagues. And because reason tells you that none of this is particular to you, you have the responsibility to provide to others what you expect for yourself. You can foster the welfare of other sentient beings by enhancing life, health, knowledge, freedom, abundance, safety, beauty, and peace. History shows that when we sympathise with others and apply our ingenuity to improving the human condition, we can make progress in doing so, and you can help to continue that progress. And he goes on to say that really in saying this, replying to the question in this way, he wasn't really sharing his own thoughts, or he hadn't come up with these things himself, but he was sharing with this young woman the ideals of the Enlightenment. Well, I think there's lots of things that could be said about this quotation. It would be fantastic to explore it in detail. I think there are some extraordinary leaps of logic there, and quite a few sort of non sequiturs, but nevertheless, I just want to point out that the general vibe of it, and that is that, in fact, he doesn't answer the question. He doesn't answer the question. She asks, why should I live? And he only replies with some reasons why she might live, why she could live, things that she can do, could do. And I think that in itself tells us something about the mood of our times when it comes to questions of meaning and purpose. The question that she asked, why should I live, is like the question of meaning and purpose in its starkest form, its most confronting form. And the French novelist, philosopher Albert Camus, he said, actually, this is really what the entire enterprise of philosophy is about. It can be reduced to this, explaining why we should live. Answering that existential question, why should I live? So in the 20th century, from his point of view, it all comes down to that question. And she asked the question, but he doesn't really answer it. He provides some options, some reasons why she might live. One writer, Emily Esfahani Smith, who I just is quoted there mentioned there at the end of your outline, has written a book recently about meaning, and she says that at the moment there's a crisis of meaning, that we have reached a stage of a crisis of meaning in our society, in Western society. And the main thing that she points to as evidence of this is that there has been a 30% rise in suicide, in the rate of suicide in the United States since 1999. That is, despite times of considerable economic prosperity and growth, despite the fact that there is considerably better care available for people experiencing mental illness or depression, the suicide rate has risen appreciably. And that actually, she says, indicates a problem that is about a crisis of meaning in our society. So I just want to explore why that might be, and think a little bit about meaning and purpose. And when we think about meaning and purpose, it's worth saying that there are two sort of classes or two main possibilities in talking about purpose in life. And one would be to talk about purpose in an objective sort of way, that is to say that there is a meaning to life. And this, I think it's fair to say, used to be the way that people talked about purpose. That is, they talked about the meaning of life, as if there was a general meaning of life that you could discover. And connected to this was the idea that the world that we live in has a coherent story, that there is an overarching narrative, a meta-narrative, a grand story in which our lives might make sense. An objective meaning. That is a meaning of life which is true, if true, was true for everyone. The other kind of way of thinking about meaning in life and purpose is the subjective way. That is, what is the purpose of my life? It's individual and subjective. It says, not that there is necessarily a great meaning to all of our lives, but that I have a meaning, I have a purpose that I follow in my life. And if once upon a time, objective meanings were much more in fashion, it's true that objective ideas about purpose have gradually been rejected and are no longer sort of the primary way that people think about purpose anymore. Why were objective ideas about purpose rejected? Well, partly they were rejected as being no longer believable. That people thinking about the world, thinking about their assumptions about the world, their beliefs about the world, came to the conclusion that no, there is no overarching story, there is no meaning to our universe, and therefore there is no objective meaning to life. Grand claims about the world and its meaning were rejected as untrue, but they were also rejected as being undesirable. It wasn't just that people couldn't believe that there was an objective meaning to life, it was that they didn't want to believe that they refused to believe that there was an objective meaning to life. And the reason for this was that people came to see that those kind of claims that there is a meaning to life and that there is an overarching story of our world, those kind of claims were believed to be inherently oppressive, that they destroyed individual freedom, that they were an attempt to impose someone else's values on our lives. In various ways, they attacked our individuality, and they've been rejected because of a commitment to individualism. And this was true it was believed of ancient narratives about the world, that life, for example, was about human beings were made to be slaves to the gods and to feed the gods, that kind of narrative about why humans existed. Or modern versions of that kind of grand narrative that said, our purpose is to serve the nation and to make our nation great. Or our purpose is to serve the state and to create a world of perfect equality. That each of us must subsume our own lives to that greater story, that greater ideal. People came to see, actually, those are just oppressive stories. They don't actually help human beings to flourish. They don't actually bring real value to our lives. And even Christianity was rejected in this kind of wholesale rejection of the idea that there's objective meaning. Another kind of oppression, another kind of rejection of individual value. And so, in response to that rejection of objective meaning, people have instead embraced personal meaning, subjective meaning. Okay, if there's no general meaning to life, then I need to find my own personal meaning. And, what kind of things have people come up with? I think, in a way, one of the surprising things about this has been, given the chance to just come up with your own meaning for life, it's surprisingly how samey the things that people have chosen to pursue as the meaning of their lives have turned out to be. That we could almost categorise them. That many of them would be about career, many of them would be about family and lifestyle, many of them would be about kind of my individual pleasure. That the goal of my life is to have a great career, to really do well in my degree, to make an impact in my field, to be known and highly regarded for what I do, to make a great contribution to the area that I work in, that kind of thing, to be recognised by others. Or it might be a dream about having a family, having a home, buying a house in a good suburb, establishing your own sort of personal castle with your family and all the things that you want to make a great lifestyle together, and see children grow up and to be successful themselves, something like that. Or to live my life in a way where I get to express myself, maybe I get to express my identity, I get to enjoy life the way that I want to. These are the kinds of things that people now would come up with as subjective meanings for life. And I think it's just worth pointing out that these things are, well, they're fragile dreams. They're fragile goals for life. They're susceptible to failure, that we might have our dream, we might have our purpose for life. It would be very easy to fail to achieve these dreams. You have this great career plan, but you have a disastrous third year, you fail uni, you drop out, you don't become the doctor, the lawyer, the teacher that you were expecting to be, or whatever it might be. Or you start your career, but you get sick, you get off track, something goes wrong, you have a major conflict at work. Suddenly your dream, your life's purpose, is under threat. But it's worth saying also that these kind of dreams are also susceptible to success. That you might succeed in them and still not find yourself fulfilled as a person. That this meaning of life turned out to be not everything that you wanted it to be. The German tennis player Boris Becker became a Wimbledon champion as a teenager. He reached the top of his profession, and his reflection on this was, I got to the top and found there was nothing there. He became the number one tennis player in the world. He found that success was totally empty. The book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible relates a similar story of someone who achieved everything that they wanted to achieve, had all the houses and possessions, had all the relationships and all the sex that he wanted. He achieved in every kind of way in his life, and yet discovered that ultimately it was all just air, just vapour, didn't amount to anything. So I think this is actually what some people are discovering, and it's worth pointing out that that high suicide rate is particularly among people in middle age, people in their 50s, ending their lives at an unprecedented rate. That they've got to that point where they're meant to have achieved the things that they set out to do. Some of them have achieved them and found them to be empty. And of course also many of those small dreams, which were about just me having my personal purpose and not fitting in with anyone else's kind of program for me, actually turned out in many ways to fit in with someone else's program for us, like the bank telling you to dream your dreams, because that fits in with their program to make money out of you. And so many of the dreams that are in fact being sold to us as purposes for our lives are in order to line the pockets of other people. The dreams turned out actually to be just as manipulatable as other dreams. And you can share your dream on Facebook, but that may become data to be harvested for someone who wants to exploit you at its most cynical. So people have small dreams, but they're vulnerable to success and to failure. Some people have large dreams. They're more idealistic about things. But again, this has proved to be problematic. Part of the thing has been that if someone has dreams of more idealistic things, peace, an end to poverty, an equal society, human rights, justice for the world, those things can be your sort of personal choice. But if they're only a personal choice, then how can you really persuade other people about them? What if other people disagree that those things really matter? What grounds do you have to say to someone else, you need to get on board with this program? In some ways, those concepts, justice, freedom, care for the poor and so on, are sort of like fragments that have been left over from the old objective meanings of the world, and people are grasping onto the fragments, but it doesn't have the story behind it to hold it up. And so it's easy for people to become disillusioned, easy for people to give up once they've run into difficulty, because so many of these problems are apparently insoluble, intractable. And so it's the cliche that today's idealistic university student is tomorrow's greedy corporate grasper. You know what I mean? That the person who wants to do legal aid now is going to be a divorce lawyer in 10 years' time. The person who wants to be a social worker now, ends up in middle management somewhere in a couple of decades, not really doing the dream that they set out to, having found it too difficult, not having a story that can really sustain them through it. The generation before mine, the sort of hippie generation, were extremely idealistic. They dreamt that the present order of things was going to be swept away and the age of Aquarius would come in. But that hippie generation ended up being the me generation of the 1980s. They ended up being a greedier generation than the generations before that. Their idealism didn't last because there was nothing to sustain it. And so there's a crisis of meaning. The personal meanings that people choose for themselves have trouble satisfying. And one of the things that people do in the face of this is just try to put aside the whole question of purpose and meaning by basically living a life which is a life of distraction. Can I distract myself from the void in my life? Can I distract myself from the fact that my life has no meaning? Well, yes, you can, actually, rather easily. There's all kinds of ways to do it, and enough reality television, the merry-go-round of Melbourne festivals. First of all, I go to the comedy festival, then I go to the Grand Prix, and then I go to the spring racing, and then there is plenty to distract you. There are lots of great things to stop you, prevent you from really thinking about this question. You can keep the question of meaning at bay for years, for decades. If you involve yourself in work, you get tied up in the things of this life, then you can ignore the question of meaning. But the crisis of meaning is still there. Well, I just want to look at some words of Jesus and just say, well, I think given the problem that's clearly there with subjective ideas about meaning, it's worth reconsidering objective ideas about meaning. And it's worth considering, is it just necessarily the case that objective ideas about meaning and the idea that the world does have an overarching story, could it be considered that that's not necessarily oppressive? That actually there might be an overarching story which would be good for you, which would be helpful for you individually to flourish and become the person that you were meant to be? Well, let's listen to Jesus, and this is an account of an incident in Jesus' life from Mark chapter 12 in the Bible. Let me read it to you. One of the teachers of the law came and heard him debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important?" "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbour as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." "Well said, teacher," the man replied. "You are right in saying that God is one and there is no one but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbour as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions. In the Bible, it's worth saying that it doesn't usually talk in terms of meaning and purpose. There's no chapter in the Bible that says the meaning of life is, and this is partly because the Jewish culture, the Hebrew culture from which the Bible emerged, was actually not that interested in abstract questions. It was a kind of very pragmatic, concrete kind of culture that dealt much more in terms of stories than propositions about what was true. But the stories would convey something about what was true and, for example, what the meaning of life is. And so here's Jesus asked about the law of Moses, which was a very big body of teaching, to just say, well, what's the most important thing there in it? And what does Jesus say is the most important thing? He says, at the heart of it, it's really about loving God, and it's about loving the people around you, your neighbours. He distills it down to this, that our meaning and purpose is loving God and loving others. And this really just builds on the picture of what human life is about that we find through the Bible, and it's right from the first page of the Bible in the book of Genesis, that God made us to know him, to be his children, that God made us to know and love each other and serve each other, that God made us to care for the world, to develop it, and to make sure that we steward it well. That these are the things that human life is about. At the very centre of it, it's about relationship and living out those relationships and experiencing those relationships forever, and that those relationships are relationships of love, which is about service, kindness, generosity to each other. In the discussion here, it's made clear that life is not about, from Jesus' point of view, from the Christian point of view, it's not about religious practices. It's not about burnt offerings and sacrifices, as the man says. The Christianity at its essence is about people enjoying God and enjoying each other, enjoying relationships of love forever. And in fact, that where everything is headed in this story is towards what Jesus calls the kingdom of God. That is, that time when people will be able to enjoy those relationships of love with God and each other in a world made right. That's the vision, that's the meaning of life that Jesus holds out. And I think it's the true meaning of life, but I also think it's a good meaning of life. And so you might want to investigate whether it's actually true, but I just want to say, as a way of finishing up, that it's actually a good meaning for life. It works. Emily Esfahani-Smith, who I mentioned before, has written a book recently called The Power of Meaning, Crafting a Life That Matters. And it's a really good book. If you want to save time, you can just listen to her TED Talk from last year, which is called There's More to Life Than Being Happy. And it's only like 12 minutes. It's brilliant. It's great. She says that to craft a life that really matters, that works in this way, you need 4 things. You need belonging, that is, relationships of love, to be understood and recognised and valued for who you are, and to do the same for others. Belonging. Secondly, purpose, a big, far-reaching goal that really motivates you. Thirdly, transcendence, connection to a higher reality than yourself. And fourthly, storytelling, a story that you tell about yourself and about the world that allows you to make sense of life. She's not a Christian, by the way. This is the outcome of her research into what really works. And I would suggest to you that Christian faith fulfills each of those 4 things magnificently. Totally. That there is a community of love to belong to, that there is a clear purpose to love God and enjoy God forever in his kingdom, that there is absolutely transcendence, knowing a God who is different to us, who is pure love, who has life in himself, it does not get more transcendent than that, and that there is a story told in the Bible which makes sense of our whole world and which makes sense of your life and mine. And it's a story which doesn't end up oppressing you or dehumanising you, but actually is a story about how you can become the very best that you could possibly be. It's a story about your potential coming out. We'll think a bit more about that in a couple of weeks' time. I've been following Jesus for 32 years. I think it's a brilliant way to live. I think it's a great way to live, and I want to recommend it to you. If you're someone who's not a follower of Jesus, I would encourage you to find out more. If you can talk to the person maybe who brought you along, or you could fill in this communication card. We'd be very happy to have arrange for someone to meet with you, open the Bible with you, find out about whether this is a true and good meaning for life. I'm going to stop there and pray. And if you'd like to ask a question, we've got a little bit of time for that. Let's pray. Lord God, I thank you that there is a meaning to life. I pray that you'd be with everyone here, that you would help us think about what we really want, and that you would help each person here to find true meaning in our lives. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you like to ask any questions? The thing didn't collapse. Are there any questions? Yes.
So we're in the time of postmodernism where it's the objective of that everyone is correct and no one can be told for what they believe. Do you think that this is what will stay as a society, like a postmodernistic expression, or do you think that is collapsing with your idea that meaning is being lost?
Yeah. It's a really good question, and I'm not a prophet. I can't kind of see into the future, but given a crisis of meaning, yes, what would then happen? I think that we can expect in many ways that people will continue to look for personal meaning in life, and that will, have its tensions and struggles, but that also we will be susceptible to claims about greater meaning that are at least kind of pseudo-objective and which are unhelpful and oppressive and idolatrous. For example, like Make America Great Again is a sort of pseudo-objective call to some kind of higher loyalty, which could give meaning to your life, but I think will prove to be not life-giving, and that there will be various forms of that. Because the individual pursuit of meaning is, I think, just very difficult to sustain. And the choose your own adventure kind of narrative of life is always under pressure from other people choosing their own adventure in ways that hurt others. And so, for example, the sort of terrorist narrative forces us to kind of say, no, there are some choices about meaning in life which are actually wrong. And that implies that there are some that are actually right. So it pushes us towards objective meaning.